Hello and welcome everybody who's joining us here for Combinations Live. We do appreciate you joining us here on our YouTube. I'm just going to pause here for a second. We got things started off with an echo, which is always something that we want to avoid, so bear with us. Okay, so I want to thank you all for joining us live. We are deeply honored to be hosting Joy James and Emmy O'Brien alongside Lara Sheehi today. Comrades, all three whose work we've learned enormously from and whose work we have the honor of lifting up and supporting with our own publishing program. Tonight we are presenting a conversation around two core themes that Joy James and Michelle O'Brien have been working on for a number of years that cohere around the concepts of the captive maternal and family abolition. This specific conversation that we're having that Lara Sheehi is going to guide us through brings into relation a number of different important themes and issues that in fact, all three of our speakers tonight have been working on for a number of years. And the conditions of this conversation we're having tonight have certainly an extremely durable and long-standing and far-reaching stakes to them, but also an enormously urgent and immediate one as well. In the first part of the program, Lara Sheehi will moderate a conversation between Joy and Michelle, and then we'll have the opportunity to pose some questions from the audience. So I do thank you for joining us in our YouTube channel, and please do post your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll have the time to address those as well. And while you're here, please do subscribe to our channel so you're notified about upcoming events we plan to stream as well. So I'll offer bios from our three speakers before handing it over to Lara to get us started. So we have Joy James here with us tonight, Ebenezer Fitch Professor of the Humanities at Williams College, who's a political philosopher who works deeply and carefully with organizers. She is editor of the Angela Y. Davis Reader, Imprisoned Intellectuals, and co-editor of the Black Feminist Reader. Joy's recent books include In Pursuit of Revolutionary Love, New Bones Abolition, Captive Maternal Agency, and the Afterlife of Erica Garner, and Contextualizing Angela Davis, The Agency and Identity of an Icon. Her edited volumes also include Beyond Cop Cities, Dismantling State and Corporate Funded Armies and Prisons, and the soon-to-be-released Engage, Indigenous, Black, and Afro-Indigenous Futures. Emmy O'Brien writes on gender, freedom, and communist theory. She is author of Family Abolition, Capitalism and the Communization of Care, and co-author of Everything for Everyone, An Oral History of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072. She co-edits two magazines, Pinko on gay communism and Parapraxis on psychoanalytic theory and politics. Her work on family abolition has been translated into several languages, including Chinese, German, Greek, French, Spanish, and Turkish. Previously, she coordinated the New York City Trans Oral History Project and worked in HIV and AIDS activism and services. Michelle completed a PhD at NYU, where she wrote on how capitalism shaped New York City's LGBTQ social movements, and is currently working in private practice psychotherapy as a clinical social worker and formation as a psychoanalyst. And we have Lara Sheehi here today as well, who's assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, Qatar, and a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. Lara's work takes up decolonial and anti-oppressive approaches to psychoanalysis, with a focus on liberation struggles in the Global South. She is co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Lara is president of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology, co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and co-editor of Counterspace and Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society. Lara is on the advisory board of the USA Palestine Mental Health Network and Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. And she's currently working on a new book, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. Okay, Lara, thank you, and I hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, my love, and تحية للجميع وشكرًا على وجودكم. Before I start off this with my wonderful panelists here, I just want to give a huge shout out to Common Notions Press. Both of our authors today have books with them, and then also the bookstore that is in Philly that holds Common Notions Press is Making World's cooperative bookstore and social center. So I just want to name this and really highlight it. You know, Malav is not going to toot his own horn, and he and Jessica work really hard to make that space. And anybody who's knows what it takes to enact revolutionary worlds, right, is this bookstore, and this press is a central piece of that. So folks in Philly, go visit them, support them. And those who are passing through Philly, perhaps you do that instead of the so-called Liberty Bell, right? You know, it's so much more to offer. So they did not tell me to say this. I'm saying this from the bottom of my heart because it's one of the most inviting places that I have been. Thank you all for being here and joining us today. I'm very excited to be in conversation with Emi and with Joy James. And one of the things that feels so important to me about both your work is how you offer with such clarity. You almost make it feel really simple, like a matter of fact. When I read your work or when I hear you speak, there's a way in which you speak right to the heart of it, and there's no mincing words, but there's something about that that's so refreshing because it's clear. And I've been really sort of taking up this idea of militant clarity, and I think your work does that, both of you. And certainly part of it for me is the ways in which you invert the entire framework of how we take up the question of the family, of care, of kinship, and insist that these are central questions and contested space that are central to revolutionary struggle. So for those who are tuning in today, this is the entry point I'm coming into the conversation today, and frames also some of the questions that I had in mind. And we have decided to go with the flow today. I have some questions in mind, but both these speakers have such a depth and breadth, and I'm sure many of you have heard them speak. And so if we go in different directions, is because their brilliance is coming through, and I'm gonna go with that. So, but to start us off, this event feels urgent to me, but I'm wanting to know from both of you about the impetus about this. Like, how do you come together in conversation? Where does this impulse come from? And how are we finding ourselves here on screen together today?
Thank you so much, Lara, for that great introduction. And I'm quite honored to be here and appreciative to Common Notions for making it possible, from Olive and others. It's this. I'm quite excited about this. I've been wanting to be in a sort of formal event with Dr. James online for some time now. Our work appeared together in the first issue of Fair Praxis magazine on the family problem. And the resonances were quite clear at that time and well before then. And then we were last on a panel together in February with Cecilia Gentili a few days before her death, and spoke again at that point about trying to do an event together when we were able to. So it's been a long time coming, and Dr. James has played a big role in instigating it and proposing it. I'll say a few words about my own enthusiasm for it, or what I imagined, which might or might not unfold. So, there are a lot of different ways of approaching family abolition, and I approach it in many different ways in my book. But one of the core concepts that I both open with, close with, and return to at different iterations is less around family policy, but more around thinking about how care works in revolutionary movements. So if the family is a white supremacist capitalist institution privatizing care, its opposite, its counterposition, then, as I position in the book, is what I call insurgent social reproduction. So the tasks of living and care and love as they circulate during rebellions and during means of sustaining mass protest and popular insurgencies. And that's been true for a long time, right? That anytime large numbers of proletarian people are in struggle against white supremacy and capitalism, they have to find find ways of sustaining themselves and taking care of each other and reproducing the rebellion. So I opened my book with an account of the Oaxaca commune of 2006 and really seeing indigenous women making food, taking care of their children, arguing politics on the barricades as a core moment of family abolition. I think in all likelihood they would not call it that at that moment. At other historical moments, people engaged in very similar activities have called it family abolition, but that form of insurgent social reproduction as embodying something of a different kind of world and a different kind of society, much more so than sort of state policies or a kind of alternative plan might do. And this, really clearly in my mind resonates, where I see really powerful inspiration from Dr. James's work on the Captive Maternal, and that both of us in different kinds of ways are grappling with these questions of thinking about revolutionary care, thinking about how people love each other in the course of rebellions, thinking about the long arc of racial capitalism and what would be required for its revolutionary overcoming and the place of revolutionary care in that. And I think Dr. James has developed articulated the Captive Maternal both as a way of understanding the long legacy of survival and rebellion in the Black revolutionary struggle and the sort of forms of love and care that would really be necessary in a successful revolutionary praxis. So I'm very excited to be here and very honored and really appreciative of it. And I think you're certainly right that there are really some very timely questions for us to grapple with right now as well.
Yeah, thank you all. I mean, I'm very appreciative of all the labor and the thought that's gone into this, but also the way in which we struggle, individually, collectively, we overlap, we diverge, we come back. And for everyone who is concerned about genocide and who will fight genocides in the plurality, particularly those funded by this empire where some of us live, that whether or not we call it a family or a unit, I don't know what we're calling ourselves these days, but I do believe, I've been thinking, again, sorry, I'm gonna be a ramble. I've been thinking about how I end my emails. I used to say peace, and now I say peace with power. So that whatever the family might be or might not be, whatever the units are, the maroons, the quilombos, however we're gonna name our formations collectively, that we will have to attain forms of power in order to deflect the predatory war. I would say just, today was a long day for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons, but I also visited with Mumia Abu-Jamal earlier, and Prison Radio has been very constructive in introducing, but also building bridges. So what is the family on the inside and the outside? What is the family that is incarcerated? What is the bridge to the outside? What is the family that is caught in a war zone? And the family on the outside have just been trying to think through that in different ways. And in the conversation with Mumia hours previously, he brought up this weirdness of family. He started talking about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, right? But he also reads the letters of Jefferson beyond, his state, I can't remember the title of the book he did, right? He talks about, Mumia was talking about a letter that Jefferson wrote when he talked about the enslaved, the captive, right? The colonized. And Jefferson had clarity, even though I think he actually is incredibly destructive and abusive in so many different registers. But what he wrote in the letter was that the enslaved, or we could say that colonized, right? Those in war zones, that 1 hour or 1 day of their suffering overwhelms the lifetime of suffering of the colonizer and the enslaver. And so under those conditions of pain, I think that the clarity whether or not the colonizer comes to their consciousness, whether or not they have a consciousness. But I think that our understanding of suffering and disposability, particularly indigenous, right, particularly those of African descent, that those realities will force us to rethink family on every metric. And however we name it, I see concentric circles. I see stages like captive maternal, caretaker, protest, movement maker, marronage is kind of the sweet point, but you have to move into war resistance because the state will come for you, the predator will come for you because autonomy is prohibited. I think then we rework the very notion of language. And I want to stop with a young sister, Maya Kearney. Yesterday, we had a conversation at the American Studies Association, and people were talking about their incarcerated loved ones or loved ones who'd been killed by police. But she talked about severed natality, and of course, Orlando Patterson, right, his work, Slavery and Social Death. But then we started thinking about what is the possibility of regrowing umbilical cords as a political project, that they sever our relations, they sever our lives, they sever our bodies and our emotional and psychological stability. But we have these generative powers to reconnect, but also, I believe, increasingly only if we acknowledge the reality of war.
Thank you both so much. My dog's saying hello to those who can hear. Part of what I'm really struck by is that the insistence on languaging these things. And I think this is where you're, both Michelle sort of came in with this, and then Joy, you were saying about like, we need to acknowledge. And I think this is part of like living in the disavowal is part of what allows for state violence to be enacted in ways that are seamless, right? And I think you're both speaking to, I just took some notes about like seizing the means of power to care, right? And how we think about that might be different in terms of different entry points, but both of you are languaging these things for us. And that's why for me, it feels so urgent, right? In a time, like you're saying, you're signaling to the many things that are happening in which the family is the target, right? No matter how we conceptualize what that family is. And here I'm gonna sort of, since you already went into the second question I have, I'm gonna move to our third question and then maybe come back, is that in this way, in the languaging around these things, many people are pointing to the fact, right, especially as we see these genocides unfolding or the sprouting up of cop cities, the forced disappearance of Indigenous women, and things, by the way, that are baked into the fabric of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and empire. These are not aberrant sort of symptoms of these things that just, happen to, come along in this late stage of capitalism, but rather a pointed target of that. So I'm wondering if the both of you can speak from your own entry point. If we're looking at the family or the sort of dismembering of family or kinship as the target of violence by the state and its proxies, both of your work speaks directly to this, but I'm wondering, how do you take up this challenge? So more specifically, how do we both understand that families, kinship, and kin ties are being purposefully dismembered, and also work towards what you both think of as different modalities, or and modalities that I don't mean like alternative, like a hyphen from the reference point, but what both of your work for me does is sort of map for us the things that are have always been there, right? And that perhaps in a normative space are not attuned to, but certainly have always happened alongside. So I'm just wondering how you hold both those things and speak to the people that might say, how do you talk about family abolition in a time when, like, in genocide, in all these sorts of things, that this is the target of the state?
Would you like to speak to this first, Dr.
Okay,
Jane?
thanks. And you can call me Joy. I know I'm old, but it's just like, you could just call me my first name. I really like that question because I'm very interested in mutations now. I don't believe that we can preserve the family as it was conceptualized and sold to us, right? like from Donna Reed to whatever they were doing, or Thomas Jefferson, like, you know, sexual predator of a young girl who is the half sister of his dead wife. You know, like family was always twisted once you come into a zone of power and domination, right? The disappearance of indigenous children, the Pope apologizes for like so many killed, right, and harmed. Foster care, a form of accumulation where you can monetize the dismemberment of predominantly or disproportionately Black children. So under the concept or the understanding, if there is a formula for mutation, maybe we could guide or shepherd that mutation, like that don't allow the state to control every aspect of your pain and your disappearance, right? That there, I keep thinking about the epicenter, the surface of politics, and the hypocenter. And in New Bones, I contrasted, and I respect Bell Hooks' work, but more like left liberal, right? And Assata would be going to ground zero where the rebels are. And we started by talking about the rebels. The rebels have mutated families, right? I mean, because some of them are underground, some of them are in prison, some of them they're disappeared. They transition, you know, as we know, violently at the hands of the state and mercenaries. So in my mind, I agree to the terms of engagement. I agree to the brokenness, but I don't agree to control over how I am broken. And so I would be willing to go into mutation and become a weird formation, an oddity, then follow the rules of the state and try to knit back a quote normal family. This is the thing about Mamie Till Mobley, which some people call like GMOM, like open casket funeral for a 14-year-old mutilated child who I believe was also sexually assaulted and defied every decorum and demanded that the mortician change nothing. He did try to put pieces together, you know, but then thousands of people come and they bring their children to look in the coffin, which someone would think that must be child abuse. But no, that is the acknowledgement of the violence that will break us, but will not leave us broken if we re-knit and flip the horror away from ourselves. It could be rhetorical, it could be other forms of resistance, but we will be broken. But those are the terms of engagement and more resistance. And that brokenness, the state cannot control. It can harm, but it cannot determine the outcome of harm. Like what new beings or entities are willing to resist based on the horror.
That was beautifully put, Joy. I have a couple of different answers to this. I think, you know, it's absolutely imperative in this moment that we politically, and this has been true forever, that we politically defend the care relations and kin relations against racist state violence, against the devastating you know, the dynamics of border violence and mass incarceration, of the family policing system, the history of slavery and anti-Indigenous genocide, of boarding schools, like separation of children and parents has been a really integral part of how white supremacy has functioned. And so I think it's absolutely important that any account of family abolition adequate for the actually existing history that we live with, to confront that, to challenge that, and to reject that. I would give two answers, one sort of thinking historically and one thinking about the struggle. So historically, the white family, the family of property, the bourgeois family, the normative family, has always been constructed through the systematic opposition to and exclusion of other kin relations. And those kin relations in the same structure of property and power that make a normative bourgeois white family possible depend on the systematic dispossession and destruction of kin and care relations of other people. And we see this in the industrial cities of 19th century capitalism in Europe. with incredible fragmentation of kin relations of proletarian people that Marx and Engels are writing about. We see this, of course, in the plantations of the New World and the dynamics of natal alienation and the tremendous violence against the care and kin relations between enslaved people. We see this in anti-Indigenous boarding schools as an instrument of genocide, that all these have always been means of amassing the fortunes and power to make normative white property families possible. So that what is being identified in family abolition is not just like, oh, I love this person, I want to spend time with them. It's a social institution that includes some while excluding others, and that's what has to be destroyed. That's what has to be taken apart. But I don't, so this I think is a very helpful rubric in thinking in a way that really valorizes certain kinds of care and kin relations as an important source of struggle and rebellion. But I don't just say that family abolition is about destroying the right property family. I think that would be a very easy form, and certainly that's the target, right? That's the enemy, that's something to challenge, like a kind of traditional or normative or bourgeois or white supremacist, whatever we want to call it. But it's also that the struggle itself transforms care relations between everyone else. And this, like Joy referenced the mutation, right? That our experience of struggle allow us to love and care in a different way. And to quote Lara, when you were presenting the parapraxis and speaking about The Algerian Family by Frantz Fanon, one of the incredible things that he talks about in that essay is how the Revolutionary War of National Liberation against French colonialism fundamentally transformed the power dynamics and relations between members of Algerian Muslim families. How because young people were leading in the struggle, that the sort of older patriarch would have to begin to listen to what his children actually had to say. And his commitment to national liberation required him to begin to secede, to give up some of his generational authority, how the dynamic involved many, many women in key positions of militancy, and that upended sort of gender dynamics within the Algerian family. And it's not that the Algerian family is a target of family abolition, right? It's a target of French colonialism, but that the family, including of colonized people, including of queer people, including of oppressed people, through struggle is transformed. And that at certain moments, the struggle demands that people step out of the private household, step out of certain forms of domestic patriarchy, and step out of heteronormativity. And if they don't do that, it becomes an instrument of the counter-revolution. And we see many, many examples of this, of how in my book, talking about the Oaxaca commune, there was a moment that the husbands of these indigenous women showed up to the barricades and were like, you have to come back and start cooking for me again. And in addition to all the tremendous state violence that they were under, this becomes an instrument of counter-revolution. So that kind of dialectic of actually recognizing both sort of care and kin relations between oppressed people as under attack, but also in struggle as under transformation and mutation.
So I'm really interested, both of you, where you see the role of children, because under the conditions of occupation, war, structural poverty, they're children, but then there's their agencies on a whole other level. Like even from a short time working with the mothers who'd lost, African American or Black mothers who'd lost their children to police violence. I mean, some of us noted that the oldest girl in the family, but sometimes it would be a boy, would take on the caretaking as the mother became more of the activist. Or when I think of Soweto, right? When the kids didn't want to speak Afrikaans, who wants to speak Afrikaans, right? But so they go into this protest and it's playful because children play and they chant, and then the bullets start flying. And in some ways, the loss of the child is what pulls the adult, the so-called adult or the parent into the fray. You know, the go back with Mamie Till Mobley, if Rosa Parks says she was thinking of Emmett Till's lynching, and that's why she didn't give up her seat on the bus. And that's a pacifist, you know, fun way to do it. But there are other ways that people, you know, have expressed this severed natality. So the child has agency, and the loss of the child is, you know, because the child's supposed to bury you, but now you're burying the child. So time is out of order. Reality is distorted. You owe nothing to the state. Right. And I'm just curious of how you see the child becoming more than the parent.
I think your examples are quite striking and point to some of the violence against children and the key role that can play in different kinds of militant struggles. Violence against children has certainly played a huge role in the image production around the genocide happening in Gaza, right? That so many children have been targeted and killed by the Israeli state. And the deaths of children have been such a central part of what it means to grieve the genocide, what it means to oppose the genocide, what it means to imagine a revolutionary opposition to the genocide. I would say in a different register, I think a lot about trans children. And one of the so trans children are, of course, a subject of intense political debate and controversy right now. That, you know, the medical decisions around children being able to transition are highly restricted in, I think, 26 states right now. There's a lot of quite legitimate fears that the Trump presidency will mean a criminalization of trans children being able to transition nationwide, and certainly would make medical care and medical access much more difficult. But like trans children express a form of agency that issues demands on their parents. And that's really striking to me, right? And it's like they ask for something. They ask for something in a certain kind of recognition, a certain kind of life, a certain kind of relationship to their gender. They ask for it in a lot of different ways, and it's always challenging, right? There's no family because, you know, people's fantasies about their children are so deeply gendered that there is no family where it doesn't shake things up at least a little bit, and often it shakes things up a lot. And the agency of trans children has created an entire social movement kind of in there, tailing them, and in many ways, right? It's like created an infrastructure of social service providers, of medical providers, of political advocates, of parents. But all these things emerge because the child themselves has made a demand, and has made a demand on the world and on the symbolic order and on some really deep ideas of how we think about gender. And like there's something in that I think is very terrifying for the right wing, and really provokes a kind of intense, panicked, fascistic response, because upending sort of how we think about gender, how we think about parental authority, and that's happening, you know, across class, across racial groups, across social demographics, I think indicates something about the nature of desire as being uncontainable and unmanageable.
Yeah, I agree, but I don't want to carve out a category of Blackness that is unique. But I think simultaneously, I mean, there's some parents, you know, you're reading to the child when they're very young, and here's two mommy family, there's a two daddy. Like you're already, if you're a progressive or liberal, whatever you want to say, you're already socializing. This is what Stonewall is. Like, let's read the stories, let's watch the video, you know, rainbow colors and so on, so forth. I still think that to be a Black child under any conditions, right, of being pansexual or being trans or being queer or being non-binary, that there's a weight that comes with the Blackness.
Of course.
And that there's a way, and even as people seek their autonomy, they have to navigate these other registers. And like I said before, I'm not really into intersectionality, like parsing out like gender. I mean, I know it exists, right? But I think there's a convergence. This is might be why I like the Captive Maternal, or not that I like it personally, right? But I went there as an analytic. That once all gender identity is queered, but not always assaulted by the state, right?
Of course, yeah.
But once there is no gender because there is function, that's what the Captive Maternal is about. I don't do identity, though I recognize it, right? But it's what you do as you manifest in your life and your own desire to love yourself. And this is why they're different kind of families. The biological family doesn't work for everybody. So that children should, and they group collectively and they raise themselves, right? Or they move on with their grandparents, or they get taken in by other people who are not even, the same race or whatever, and allowed to manifest their own love for themselves and their love for the world. But that only works if you have a function. And this is what I'm driving down on. The function is the political engagement against the oppressor. If your biological family rejects you, that's incredibly painful. But I've seen youth who've been able to create families out of like a same age cohort, right? And with younger people and taking care of them. So the function, because I see war everywhere. And I get, there's especially this new administration, they're going to burn everything down. Got it. So how do you survive that? And I never thought the biological family or the formal family or the legal family was a vehicle for anything. It would be autonomy. That's why in Captive Maternal, autonomy is so important. To create the maroon is to create the new family that accepts and loves and nourishes you. But there are families that can be open to all kinds of gender expression and still be fascistic, still be oppressive, so there's nothing about family that is safe, no matter however it expresses its identity based on race, class, gender, or even ideology. I think it's deeper than that. I think it would have to be a spiritual risk of accepting mutations. I guess this is why I keep talking about mutations. I don't think anything's stable, so I don't think anything can be forced upon people, but people cannot do gratuitous violence, verbal, emotional, psychological, physical, sexual. That is all banned. War resistance is accepted. Predatory acts, which happens with all groups, that is to be rejected.
I want to share a little bit about something of my personal experience that I think speaks to a couple of these questions. So I came out as trans in 2000. So a little while ago. I had just gotten out of college, and I was in a queer punk scene on the West Coast. I had gone to college in the Midwest, but I was in a queer punk scene, and I knew a lot of trans people, but none of them were trans women. They were all trans masculine, non-binary, trans men. And I knew like 3 or 4 trans women close to my age, and I went to a local queer center and met like a handful of trans people who were seniors, who were in their 60s and 70s at that time, and felt pretty isolated, but sort of found my way and was in a kind of anarchist scene and saw my politics in terms of a kind of radical queer praxis, and thought about my gender partially through those terms. And Riot Girl was very inspirational for me in sort of finding a form of femininity that I identified with. And then I moved to Philadelphia and went to a queer youth center, and immediately met 50 young Black trans women within a week, right? And like on the East Coast, there were in the 2000s these huge underground ballroom communities that had created the infrastructure, the kind of surrogate families and mutual aid and practice that enabled large numbers of working class Black and Latino trans women to come out and transition. Some of them maintained strong contact with their families of origin. Some didn't. It varied a lot. Some took really good care of each other. Others got in like brutal rivalrous competitions with each other, which was a big part of the ballroom scene. And there were many trans women who were like, that I met in Philadelphia, were like, oh, nothing to do with ballroom ever again. Like that scene was really mean. But they're transitioning, they're coming out, their lives were so tied up with the existence of this whole underground world. The like white trans women had no parallels at all. And to call them trans was right on the cusp. You know, historically, there are a lot of different ways of relating the genders in ballroom communities. And many of these women identified as femme queens, but in the early 2000s was right on a cusp where more and more people in the ballroom scene were getting plugged into a nonprofit AIDS infrastructure, where they started using terminology that was intelligible to white people, including trans women. So, you know, there's a complex dialectic there, but like, there's no question, you know, but the ballroom scene has roots in like 1920s Harlem and the long legacy of Black queer struggle and survival in New York City. And I would argue a kind of rebellion and resistance to the enforced heterosexuality that was part of Jim Crow land tenancy in the South. And so, you know, this sort of thinking about, you know, figuring out terms is difficult, but thinking about the trans child, thinking about the desire of the trans child, like that has had a long, deep historical links to Black survival and Black rebellion. And in many ways, the Black struggle has been a key vanguard to make trans liberation conceivable and possible.
Yeah, that's part of our history. I mean, from Stonewall, I mean, Afeni Shakur, I believe that was it Afeni, Tupac's mom? She was in the Women's House of Detention once the rebellion started. And, you know, and they were grouped as women in the Women's House of Detention. They started setting their mattresses on fire in solidarity. And she wrote to Huey Newton, who's complicated. I don't see this, I guess maybe even though I'm saying the Captive Maternal has this fluidity, I've rooted it in Black culture. Yeah. And so to the extent that we understand our Black culture, whether it's in text or we have generations of families, which are all diverse in different ways, I'm going to maintain there is a particularity about Black struggle. So like, from Vincent Wooders, The Delectable Negro, I think that's the title of it. James Baldwin, I mean, we have this is all the strength. It's always been in our movements, right? At what point, this is what I'm curious about, at what point is function as important as identity? And the awareness that identity and how we converge or we diverge from each other, that the ability to mobilize against war. I mean, the understanding is they're not just going to come for this segment of people, they're coming for everybody. So what would be the connection? What would supersede the differences? Not to say that there shouldn't be protections, there should be protections, but the protections are really understood as multi-targeted, if that makes sense. So like the people, the women who are, you know, dying because they can't get abortions, right? I mean, I think disproportionately it's going to be Indigenous and Black people with no money who go first, and meaning into the grave or into a carceral setting. And the rebels would be following them soon after. So these are the protected, you know, there are people who are very wealthy and who have these identities of femininity or identities of masculinity or identities as married or whatever. I think the wealth will give them some level of protection. I think linking yourself to an influential nonprofit will give you protection. I think to the extent you can hold on a job in academia, particularly the elite sector, that these identities will have a modicum of protections, right? But the poverty and those who are impoverished and who are willing to fight, those are a link, but they're different. I guess maybe the way I'm figuring this out in real time, and maybe this is what my scholarships have been about, It's been about the fighters. And so whatever their particular identities are, they're all important, but it was whether or not they would engage in the fight. And most of us, including, moi, most of us are frightened to go to war against a warring state. So we need our integrity, we need our safety, we need to enjoy our lives. But under these conditions of constant war and imperialism, those possibilities are fading. So I'm interested in the mobilization across so-called differences.
Beautifully put.
One of the things that I was thinking about as you both were speaking is about Nadira Shalhoub-Kavrukyan's work about unchilding in the context of Palestine and the ways in which she reads that children specifically become capital in the hands of the state, right? And part of that, and this is where the logic, I think, that there are particularities that are different, but certainly logics, whether it's Black children, Indigenous children, trans children, that the commonality that I'm seeing, the thread, is the fear of a future that includes this possibility of that adult, right? And so the targeting of the children as capital is also a divestment from the possibility of them becoming fighters, like you're saying. And we're seeing this in the language, right? Where every Palestinian child in Gaza is a potential terrorist, is a potential fighter. But they're also saying, is there a potential militant? And it's a militant that is specifically made and sort of comes into being in antagonism with the state, an antagonism with the state that's intent from its inception on the erasure of that child, right? There's almost a confessional aspect of this about who gets targeted by the state and in what order, like you're sort of, laying it out. There feels to be a confession back to what you were saying, Michelle, about like the construction of the white cis hetero family, right? Is that the whole point of that is an identification with the state and the idea that the violence is needed, right, to sustain settler and white supremacist futures. And so this is where desire and identification, I think, come in with and that becomes a necessity of dispossession and displacement of everybody else. And so in many ways, perhaps like, how do we ready ourselves for this is a process of divestment from those fantasies, but also a divestment from the identification with what the state has laid out in terms of what creates safety, like you're saying, Joy, like how do you not get targeted, or how do you not get pulled into the war? But if we're talking about the ways in which identification with those systems are needed to perpetuate the targeting of a particular type of body or people, then that, I think, becomes part of the question, right? Of are we ready to go to war? That there's a psychic element to that I'm thinking about as well. I wanted to ask one more question to you all before we turn it. I know Malava just put in there, like, let's ask questions. This might be a good segue into militancy, the question of militancy. I've been almost obsessional about thinking about what it means to maintain psychic militancy, militant clarity, and an ability to tap into militant refusal. So I'm wondering, for the both of you, how you're thinking about militancy. I think sometimes militancy means taking up arms, and that might be an inevitability when we're talking about war, right? And we see that people have done that. And also, I think there are versions of militancy that might not always include that. So just wondering where you both are at in thinking from your work or through your work around ideas of militancy, especially in this moment.
Michelle, you want to go first? No, I don't either. Okay, so there was a panel the other day at the American Studies Association, and you could look it up. It was about resistance, but it was also about war. I call it war resistance. And it was about revenge. Revenge was in the title. And so there were, all the important people who've done so much work. Ori was there, Dylan was there, Stephanie Lumsden, I messed up her name. She's in, give a plug. This is a collective book. She's in it. Number of Indigenous people, Afro-Indigenous, Black are in it. So I'm listening to the talk, and it's trying to grapple with what we're talking about. We all deserve protections, right? And it's clear we're not going to get them from the state. It's a predatory formation. So then I asked about the fear factor. We say we want, and then I also talked, you know, because when I was in seminary, worked with women who oppose DV, domestic violence, and their position, which was my position too, you had the right to engage physically, and that is not an act of aggression. It's an act of self-love. So if you're being harassed or haunted or battered, or, you know, as a trans woman, as a trans child, as a Black person, as Indigenous, we can go down the whole list, impoverished, right? Undocumented, unhoused, you have the right to preserve yourself on every register. Now, you will be punished for it because the state has already criminalized your very being. But the ability to claim yourself back from that zone of fear, you can't really have consensus in large gatherings anyway. But I was curious about how our fear to fight, becomes like a quagmire. And so, yes, we should all be protected, and people are more vulnerable than others. But that's why I was looking for the unification of the fight, right? Which means you would have to discipline yourself against your biases and your bigotry if you want to make it out through this war. And I don't know how disciplined we are in this moment. And I don't know how much fear has eroded our confidence that we can collectively unite, protect, and love each other, as Mumia says, revolutionary love, in order to face what is already here and the impact, the devastating impact that is coming.
I use the term militant a lot to describe people in struggle, to describe a kind of stance of refusal of oppression, commitment to liberation, commitment to solidarity, commitment to each other's well-being. And that requires a certain kind of antagonism, right? An antagonism against whatever it is, the state, the forces of colonialism, the forces of capital, that this, antagonism and willingness for that to be a confrontation, for that to be an escalation, for that to, so much of our social order depends on a form of naturalized day-to-day violence that's all around us. And that violence, when you refuse it, it escalates very quickly. Right. And inevitably on some level. And that the position of militancy is a position of refusing that normalized violence and being willing to confront and oppose that escalated violence. And that strikes me as just absolutely essential as a way of thinking about movements, and that any fear or hesitancy about notions of militancy very quickly become a form of acquiescence in the existing social order. There are much more complicated questions about violence, right? I think it's quite self-evident that there are political conjunctures in the world that mass revolutionary violence is necessary, is appropriate, is absolutely essential. I think, we can debate what those are, but violence played a very, very important role in the overthrow of slavery in the United States and the overthrow of colonialism around the world. Certainly will play a key role in if we ever find a way out of class society. And violence does terrible things to everybody involved often. I think Fanon is very interested in this way, where he's often celebrated as a figure of the valorization of revolutionary violence, that violence is a means of radical transformation of an oppressed person into a form of sort of revolutionary agency that can be quite empowering, and of course that can be true to some extent. But Fanon was also very attentive to how much engagement with revolutionary violence could be profoundly traumatic for many, many people and quite devastating. And while sort of unabashedly defending militancy and recognizing the necessity and appropriateness of violence in many, many settings, really hesitate around any sort of romantic idealization of it. I think, in thinking about healing, thinking about care, thinking about revolutionary love, one of that is how do we care for each other if we go through the trauma, both of the violence of the state, but also the violence of what it means to really fight back with a certain amount of fierceness, and how does that affect our hearts, and then how do we love for each other in figuring out how to heal from that. So I, with the man Abdul Hadi, co-wrote this novel, Everything for Everyone, that depicts a kind of revolutionary future. And one of the things that shows up a lot in the book is many, many different ways of trying to heal from trauma. And that's about the trauma of the crisis of racial capitalism, but that's also about the trauma of having gone through a revolutionary armed struggle to overthrow it for many people, and that the healing becomes a really, really important task of the revolutionary society.
I know we're running out of time and we need to, but I just thank you all. This is like really making me think. So I want to pose a question here, and I'm fine. Like if I'm wrong, I don't like that's nice, because it's like, okay, go back to the workshop. I don't use the language of the Afro-pessimism analytic, or it's a school of thought, but I respect it and the people who helped create it. But I'm wondering if there's a certain point where we, even though we appear with these identities, which spark sometimes attraction and sometimes revulsion, whatever, depending on what corner of the street. But I'm wondering if the warrior becomes the mutation that I'm looking for. And maybe that is why I'm still a feminist. I don't care what anybody else says, still a black feminist, you can't kick me out. But I do you think that the movement towards the captive maternal has been movement towards the warrior and the acceptance of the violence and the death, which mostly I would retreat from and try to like how it's reckoned? I just feel that certain of us as people, different sectors, that the life itself from, from your grandparents who were child laborers to, or in war zones, or then they fought in war zones for imperial, whatever, that the destabilization has gone to the core. And so that the only thing left is a mutation. And so gender is real, sexual identity is real, class is real, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in a way, I'm just shutting this because I'm looking for the warrior. And I'm not even saying that I am inherently one or they have the courage, but that just seems to be the only logic and the only expression of love that is honest.
Yeah. I mean, we have a question, I think, that goes to this, right? Is the follow-up of the best pedagogical or relational tools to counteract the fear factor that gets in the way of war resistance. And here I want to sort of bring this in. I'm thinking of Layla Khalid, who also said, when I pick up the gun, I'm no longer a refugee, which feels so powerful. That yes, it's about armed resistance, but it's also about the precondition. And this is the Fanonian part. The precondition is the fact that you're dislocated and dispossessed from your land. And that is what the picking up the gun then transforms you back, takes you back home, because you were forced into being a refugee. And in some ways, Joy, I hear you saying an invitation, an invocation in some ways for me is like, there's a way in which we submit to the surety that we may die under these violent conditions. But in many ways, that is also us seizing the means of the power to live, and not go back to what you were saying before of not allowing the state to dictate the conditions of life and then also death, right? Like both these conditions, if you are going to dictate and circumscribe the way in which I live, there are ways in which I think we're creating lives otherwise in that. What does it mean to then also say that in taking up the fight to live, that death might be a part of that? And that is, I think, every revolutionary struggle. And perhaps the struggle is us to think about, okay, that maybe for me, I'm thinking to this question, and I'd love to hear from you all, is that it's not about excising the fear, right? Because the fear is there because in many ways we're registering the material conditions that we've been living under, and the terrorizing effect of the state, which is the point, the sort of internalization of what the potentials might be, and then also to transcend that anyway, and to say, this will be what I commit to, even if these are the possibilities. I mean, we're seeing that in Gaza. We saw that in Algeria. We saw that in Vietnam. We saw it with, folks who rose up again and again against their enslavers, right? There's all these ways in which there's a surety almost there. And that surety is where the power came from, right? So I'm wondering if you all have ideas about like fear and still do anyway, I suppose is what I'm thinking about. But I wonder if you have thoughts about that as a follow-up. Michelle?
I don't have a profound answer to this. I think broadly, in broad strokes, you're certainly right that I think there are certain kinds of macho postures that are designed to obscure fear by like artificially producing the performance of their opposite. And I think fear is quite appropriate in all sorts of situations when you're facing the state. And I think there's nothing wrong with being afraid, right? And it's about how we use that fear and what it's alloyed to, and how we put it to work, right? To what extent is our fear demobilizing us? To what extent is our fear isolating and atomizing us, fragmenting our solidarities? And when do we respond to that fear with a certain kind of commitment to each other, a commitment to resistance, a commitment to our survival? And in concrete political conjunctures, like, I've been in union organizing campaigns, and people's fear about how their employer or manager might retaliate, you have to actually talk about what those retaliations look like. And, in union work, we talk about inoculation. You talk through the bad things that could happen, and you actually put together like responses to it and means of resisting it. And there's forms of stepped escalation that people experience a small form of confrontation partially as a means of steeling themselves or training themselves to be able to engage in a more intense form of confrontation. And this happens less in union work, but it happens occasionally, but it happens all the time in the streets, where also things explosively escalate and something of the fear falls away. I mean, I'll never forget the moment I saw riot cops running from me in fear, not me personally, but the crowd that I was a part of, and how really extraordinary that is an experience to encounter something of the power of mass action that emerges during certain kinds of spontaneous conditions. And the experience of these sort of moments of really escalated rebellion can do a lot to carry people through years of organizing afterwards.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I also know that people have asked about the best pedagogical and relational tools to counteract the fear factor that gets in the way of war resistance. And I just want to read like a couple sentences from Mumia on the afterword of In Pursuit of Revolutionary Love. In it, he writes, I thought the most impressive exemplar of the Captive Maternal was the freedom fighter we remember as Harriet Tubman, whom captives in the slave South knew as, quote, General Moses, end quote. Tubman, born Araminta Ross, to this writer's recollection, had no children of her flesh, but her loving and caring and freedom works freed not only her mother, father, and most of her siblings, but literally also hundreds of other captives of the slave South through her numerous treks there. Perhaps most spectacular during the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina during the heat of the U.S. Civil War, when several hundred Black captives, men, women, and children, escaped from the clutches of their Southern prison state. How many thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, are still living in U.S. cities today because of the love and care of General Moses, end quote. So for me, pedagogy is important, the tools are important, and it may seem really abstract, but this is what I've learned from Mumia and other people, particularly political prisoners. Mumia has been in for 44 years, and people inside have tried to kill him, in different ways, through medical neglect or harm. And when they shot him on the street, they were trying to kill him there as well. it seems to me that revolutionary love is not an abstraction. It is actually concretized, but only through a kind of existential or material practice that allows you to know it's more than a figment of imagination and more than a posture of being like a revolutionary, in quotes. So one of the things when I'm talking to my communities, the issue of spirituality, whatever our religious interests are or commitments, the issue of spirituality ties us through generations. So back to Tubman or General Moses, right? The CIA created an image of her. It would be sacrilegious, right? Created an image of our ancestor, a freedom fighter, and put it in the CIA quad and said she works for us. This, I mean, the enslavement narrative is more than a narrative. The purchase, the violence, and then re-engineering the very meaning of your people. I mean, right now, you know, it's just the vile projections on Palestinians, and then remember what's going on in Haiti and Sudan and Chad and Rohingya, right? It's like this engineering of our reality by the capture of the language and the meaning of our ancestors. So yes, pedagogy, yes, relational tools, yes, training, but there has to be a memory of our past tied to the present and the future and what our ancestors left us. And they were fighters, so we will be fighters to some degree, but we would have to learn from the past to understand how to wage more successful resistance to the present moment.
Absolutely. I think about this also about like the demand to dislocate us from those pasts as a way to insist that the future doesn't come, right? And that is, I think, part of the militant clarity that I'm thinking about. Particularly, I'm thinking here about Lebanon, for example. You know, growing up and being subject, whether it's by colonial powers or by imperial powers, to a forgetting of the revolutionaries who fought in one struggle against settler colonialism and imperialism, right? And we were always, as a Lebanese, always taught that those are Palestinians that were fighting, when it was like Lebanese and Palestinians were fighting the same fight against the same oppressive structures, and we had revolutionaries too. And that was the most moving thing that radicalized me, was to be like, no, there has been a long struggle, and then studying that and saying, okay, what does that mean for the iterations right now? What does that mean for them being connected to that struggle too? I see another question here for folks. Can you speak to the tactic of disablement as a way of demobilizing war resistors by demanding intensive care work?
I think this would be a good one for you to tackle, Joy. Okay, I'll say a little bit. Healing is hard, right? Healing really takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And you know, I because of my work as a therapist, I think a lot about sort of psychological trauma, the tremendous harm of sexual violence, for example, among others. And sexual violence, you know, plays a very important role in counterinsurgency, right? There's a lot of examples of FBI informants, of opposition occupying troops, of confidential, you know, informants, agents of the state engaging in sexual violence as an instrument of war and as an instrument of demobilizing struggle. And it can have very powerful effects in really fostering distrust between people. I say Daniel's comment about the opposite of fear being trust, right? Really fragmenting people's care and relations with each other. And that I think creating both integrating healing practices into our movement in ways that aren't demobilizing, that sustain and nurture the struggle, thinking about the captive maternal, thinking about insurgent social reproduction, and at the same time, like directly challenging some of the forms of you called it disablement. I'll use the example of sexual violence as a counterinsurgent tactic, like creating cultures that directly call out harmful behaviors within our movements, within our struggles, and do that in ways that foster solidarity and support for each other. like often struggles around sexual assault within movements can end up really fragmenting people, really isolating people. Like people, survivors can really struggle to find the support that they need. And I think creating certain kinds of movement spaces built around care can be a way, an antidote to that, and a way of identifying and expelling and identifying and rejecting people who are engaging in harm in ways that enable state violence to continue.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would just add, I mean, I see Facilia and Daniel have questions. Facilia's asking about the tactic of disablement as a way of demobilizing more resistors by demanding intensive care work. And I agree. I mean, this is what Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski wrote, Indiscriminate Deterrence, I think in the 1980s. And they say the future of warfare would target civilians. The majority of casualties are going to be women and children, non-combatants, right? And so, because what you're trying to do is terrorize culture and terrorize the mind, right, of people. And so these, again, are not, you're really targeting the most vulnerable people in order to message that you are supreme power, which means you're a deity, life over death, but you can't bring life again. So that's why I say you're not a deity. And so now we have to figure out how to resist. And then Daniel's writing about, I have been thinking that the opposite of fear is in fact trust. And I would just say, that's not been my experience. Like there's been too much stuff going on for me to be trusting a lot of different sectors, but I do trust in a resistance, like not as an abstract concept and not freedom as an abstract concept, but the material struggle and learning from people who trained me. And then there are people who train you and you learn things, or maybe you mess up. There's always going to be betrayal because it's baked in with the fear factor. And I don't know how you get over fear, but maybe you learn to struggle with fear, like as a companion. But I still am thinking about revolutionary love in a way as a transcendent, not mystical endeavor structured by discipline, that even if you're afraid, you still say what you believe to be right. You still organize. Like the sheltering is really hiding out in a shelter that will eventually collapse on us, because that shelter is mostly built by the state and by the nonprofits that work with the state. So it's not stable. And that's why I go for the maroon. There's like for Seferina in Brazil, the quilombos, there's a wildness to love. Like with your children, like, there's some people that love their children. I don't know, whatever kind of person you're going to be, it's fine with me. Some people, they love their partners. Some people have no children, have no partners, but they love the earth. They love the trees. They love the sky. They love clean water. It's that passion that makes us unpredictable. And so that maybe it doesn't make us fearless, but we're going to do it anyway.
I'm thinking about, as you're talking, I'm thinking about defiance as a way of like dictate, it's not about not fearing fear, but acting in defiance anyway. And I'm recalling a paper that Nadir Shalhoub-Kavarkian and Razan Quran wrote about kids. And this goes back to sort of bringing back this kids in Al-Quds in Jerusalem, playing hide and seek with the settler soldiers in their alleyways. And this also takes an attunement to a different process that's happening. Some of us can look at that and say, oh my gosh, and we might read it, right? Certainly the clinical world can read that as like maybe a reaction formation against trauma or mastery or anything. Or to say that that is one way in which the act of defiance can overcome what otherwise would be demobilizing fear. And here they are insisting, I know my neighborhood and you don't. So I'm going to take you through this, place of playing hide and seek, not because I don't know that you could murder me on the spot, which we have seen settler soldiers do in Palestine and their proxies here in the United States in terms of cops with Black children, right? But to say, no, I insist that I know this space and you don't. And that part of that is part of my defiance too.
Yeah, and I just want to add, because I was still reading the chat and there's all these great questions, maybe back to the person who's asking about trust. I'm not dismantling trust or advocating for dismantling trust any more than I would dismantle housing or food or shelter or medical care. I'm trying to figure, and partly in conversation with Mumia and with others who have taught us by their sacrifices, because they went to war when they were teenagers, right? I'm trying to understand that if trust is like us, we have good days and not so good days, we make errors or whatever, is there something like Agape? And I've talked about that in several books, which is a disciplined form of love. It's not romantic, it's not frivolous, it's not dating, it's nothing like that. It's just, I would trust in that. I would trust that my care, which would go on beyond caretaking of people who are suffering, as important as that is, and I would contribute to that, but I would be willing to inch or to run towards an engagement that is more than always mending broken bones. And that was the new bones, like the state will shatter your bones and then we mend them. And we can keep doing that, but also we can see if we can disable your machinery to some extent. And I don't know how you want to label it, but I am saying that revolutionary love or agape is how I will discipline myself to work with people. And you can call that trust if you want, but it's a relationship based on ancestors and the unborn. I'm not going to rely totally on whoever's breathing right now. That's not how it works for me. That's not why I would go into a trek, or I've seen other people go into a trek to reach, to risk their lives. They can see past, present, and future, and they can feel it. So I trust the ancestors, I trust the unborn, and I trust our capacity to resist war. And I think you're probably saying the same thing, but I'm using maybe different language, and maybe it seems abstract, but I don't have a problem with that.
There are a couple of questions sort of about thinking about care infrastructure in the chat, both in terms of a resistance, how to grapple with increasing commodified or disciplined care infrastructure, and then also how care infrastructure can be a stabilizing influence in people's lives. I'm a strong defender of care infrastructure in all its non-nefarious forms, right? We certainly everyone needs access to healthcare, needs access to decent mental health care, needs access to, the decent supports to be able to sustain our lives. And I think there's no there are occasional ideas, I'm not sure they're really left, that opposing these things will sort of escalate the contradictions and getting people to struggle more. And I think that's just not really how it works. But I will say that I don't think of my work as a psychoanalyst, as a therapist, as revolutionary. It's my job. It's my day job. I do it, and hopefully it's a benefit to people. And it, maybe once in a while it has some opens onto something revolutionary for people. But what is revolutionary is when care infrastructures become integrated within rebellions. So within the struggle itself, the same care activities that outside are part of the social reproduction of capitalist society, the survival of working class people, the basic kin relations that keep us alive, within the rebellion become means of sustaining the struggle against the state and capital. And, there are many, many examples of this. One very simple one is the protest kitchen, right? We all cook food for each other. We feed each other. It's a form of love. It's really quite admirable. It's quite worthwhile. We do it. We also pay other people to cook for us, or we get paid to cook for other people, right? There's a huge material infrastructure around kitchens. around restaurants. And sometimes that cooking becomes an activity of sustaining the rebellion, of people being able to eat together in a occupation, in a guerrilla camp, in a square occupation, right? In a strike, in a building seizure, like that same activity of cooking for a group can become a means of people being able to stay in the struggle together and people being able to build solidarity and care with each other in a direct confrontation, right? In a direct struggle. And that I think there are a lot of other examples of that. There's an organizing project in New York that's thinking a lot about, I shouldn't get too into it. I'm not sure which aspects of it are public, but like there's a lot of good thinking among some therapists and analysts in the world about how do psychological dynamics, group dynamics work within our political struggles, within our movements, and what do we have to contribute on that front? You know, and that's an example, like we all have a lot of skills, we all have a lot of capacities, we all have a lot we can offer. Teaching, right? I teach sometimes in NYU. I've taught a lot. I've been taught at university on and off for 15 years now. And once in a while, I'll get to teach in the context of a rebellion, right? Be able to do a workshop in the middle of an occupation, being able to do political education and consciousness raising, which is also about transforming me, not just other people, right? So that pedagogy can become integrated into the struggle itself. And I think that recognizing these moments where care activity become means of sustaining the struggle. So it's not the activity itself that is where the political content is. It's about its context. It's about the relationships that it builds and sustains. And it's about how it's positioned structurally vis-a-vis capitalism.
Thank you for that. I also want to say Daniel asked a more complicated question that I positioned it. So thank you, Daniel. And yeah, I agree with what you put in the chat. I was just trying to explain the way I was seeing things. I would say, like, as I go for the wrap, right? I feel that this gathering right here is a form of resistance. But I also go back to, I was trying to differentiate between the epicenter, the surface of struggle, and the hypocenter, where I would place bell hooks with all of her gifts and contributions on the epicenter of progressivism, you know, to end rape, to end, you know, there's all these ills, imperialism, patriarchy that she wrote about was very important. But when I go down to the hypocenter, ground zero, that's where I find Asada and others. So that the material war exists, and most of us can avoid it until we can't, right? But I'm always curious about the bridge. What is the stairway? What's the escalator going up and down that we can support the rebels, the people on the front lines, right? Like, so there's a way where we have a modicum or maybe a lot of comfort, stability, whatever, but it's the people who risk everything that it appears that they're irrational. Why don't they just agree to being defeated? They won't, because they're alive. And so our life forms are dependent on the people who demand life for everyone. And so at some level, we're going to have to go down and up that ladder. And I never say that I'm a revolutionary. I just say, like, I've met them. And their love, and they have other issues going on, but the intensity of their love is radiant, and it doesn't do linear time and space. It's just, it's here, but it's somewhere else at the same time. And that is what life is. We're here, but we also project ourselves through and beyond struggle to another space and time. And I've seen the people do it, and we know the ancestors who've done it, which is the only reason we can talk together now.
Your comment, Joy, about the ancestors and the not yet born, I think is very, very important to all of this. That we have a symbolic debt in our generation. And capitalism, racial capitalism, is one way of organizing symbolic debts around money and property and wealth and power. And I think part of the struggle is not just building trust between person to person, but also building an alternative kind of symbolic debt. And it's one about our commitment to the future and about continuing the struggles of generations in the past.
Well, and I think in many ways, there's also an invitation to think about how does every place become a place of struggle and revolution, right? So maybe this is where Michelle and I, we might differ on our work as necessitating that, how that looks and what that looks like, right, in different spaces is something to take up. And also, for me, is everything becomes a weapon towards revolutionary struggle, and how do we transform those spaces so that it doesn't become a space where we can, like you were saying, Joyce, sort of stabilize or hide or potentially feel like this is a space that's outside of this is a space that cannot include, right, this persistent fight or this persistent revolutionary love or struggle around that, because that it's after us all.
I know we're winding down. I'm grateful to all of you, and I totally agree. It just also in my mind, I think about the uniqueness of the political prisoners, Leonard Peltier, Mumia, Kamal Siddiqui, and the political prisoners globally, right? The political prisoners detained in Israel, the political prisoners detained. I mean, we could go around the globe that we're not trying to emulate or create, how does it say, icons, but there's an intimacy, there's a link, and so their disappearance will be tied to our disappearance, which is why we can't let them be disappeared any more than we would allow ourselves or our children or our elders to be disappeared.
Mm-hmm. I think we're running into the last 3 minutes of what we had scheduled. So if there are any final thoughts that the both of you have or want to leave our audience with, I invite you to do that now.
Yeah, I think I want to repeat something around thinking about insurgent social reproduction as an analytic. That family abolition, there's a long legacy of revolutionaries of many different stripes identifying what they are targeting or challenging or trying to rethink as the family. And I think that's a legacy worth resurrecting and worth talking about and worth bringing into the present as a political process. But there's another register for family abolition for me, which is as an actually existing phenomenon that unfolds in all mass struggles. That when large numbers of working class people find themselves in direct confrontation with the state and capital, the private household and the normative nuclear family and the organization of authority and power that constitutes the family unit comes under pressure. It needs to be moved beyond. It needs to be loosened up at the very minimum for people to be able to engage and struggle. And as rebellions unfold, it radically transforms how everyone involved understands kinship and care, and radically transforms the material practices of reproducing our daily lives that are, traditionally, often, usually done within families, suddenly have to become collective practices of the rebellion itself. And I think this is a way of thinking about family abolition and social reproduction that there is far, far too little work on. That actually Joy and my work are among a handful of people, and there are others, of course, in the past, but it's a remarkably small number who really attend to how struggles transform kin relations and care relations and transform the material practices of social reproduction. And that this is a whole sort of mode of understanding what struggles do historically and now that I think is analytically very, very helpful. Because as we attend to that, there's a lot of debate about what is the relationship between union organizing and queer rights, and I teach classes about this and I have a lot to say about this. But one of the things is that the sorts of camaraderie in the struggle itself transform how people understand love. and like recognizing that these connections go very, very deep, is a whole way of rethinking how we understand intersectionality, how we understand identity, how we understand solidarity, that actually recognizing that this struggle demands a transformation in how we understand our care relations with each other.
Thank you. And I would just echo what Michelle said. I mean, I'm not trying to preserve the nuclear family. It's a very warped and dangerous zone, you know, as a manufactured by a predatory colonial culture. But I would say, in less words, like to Emma, the question, what gives you trust in our ability to resist war? I believe, even if I can't define terms, I have experienced love, and I've seen people who love and who risk, and I've seen people who risk their lives and everything for their children. And so our fear of death does not define us. Our embrace of love, and I never said we would win the war. I just said we would resist it. And that I believe to be true based on the reality, the material, the what people are doing right now. We're not going to roll over and die easily, and we're not going to be enslaved in different modalities. So organically, we will resist. The question becomes how we expand capacity while we expand and extend love.
I'll say we're going to win the war. I don't know when, and I don't know how, but I believe that we will.
Every iteration. Every iteration. Thank you to you both so much for this. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you and be able to think alongside you and have my juices going too. I appreciate you very much and all the labor that goes into this. And thank you to the great folks at Common Notions for making this happen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you all.